My daughter and her husband cleaned out my workshop, changed the locks on my own property, and told me I was too old to be useful anymore. I smiled, drove to my lawyer's office, and made 3 phone calls. 4 days later, they left 89 messages begging me to pick up. They thought they'd gotten rid of a tired old man. They had no idea what they'd actually done. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and drop a comment telling me what time it is where you are right now. The drive back from Tofino takes about 6 hours if you don't rush, and I never rush anymore. I've been out there for 5 days with my old fishing buddy Keith, the 2 of us renting the same cabin we'd been going to since our wives were still alive. Halibut weren't cooperating, but the weather was good and the coffee was strong, and honestly, that's enough at 67. I came around the last bend of the gravel road onto my property just after 4 in the afternoon. The light was doing that golden October thing it does in British Columbia, turning everything amber and warm. For a second, the farm looked exactly the way it always had. The old cedar-sided house, the barn I'd spent 3 summers rebuilding, the equipment shed my father had put up before I was born. Then I noticed the pile. It was stacked against the fence line near the road. Toolboxes, wooden crates, the green metal cabinet I kept in the workshop since 1987. A tarp had been thrown over part of it, but the top had slid off in the wind, and I could see what was underneath. My lathe. My grandfather's hand planes, still in their original wooden case. The band saw I'd saved 4 months to buy when I was 32. I sat in the truck with the engine running and just looked at it. Someone made a mistake. Has to be a mistake. Maybe they were moving things to make room for something. Maybe there was a repair happening. Maybe Keith had called ahead and arranged some kind of surprise project that had gone sideways. But even as I was thinking it, I knew, the way you know certain things when you've been alive long enough. I got out slowly. My back had stiffened on the drive, and the cold air hit me square in the chest. I walked to the pile and crouched down. The hand planes were sitting open, exposed to the rain we'd had 2 days ago. The blades had already started to rust. My grandfather had brought those from Scotland in 1931. He'd taught me to sharpen them when I was 8 years old, standing on a step stool in this very workshop. I picked one up. Water had gotten into the wooden tote. The grain had swelled. I set it back down. The workshop door had a new lock on it. A deadbolt, installed recently. I could see the fresh wood shavings still on the ground beneath the strike plate. My key didn't fit. I tried it 3 times the way you do when your brain refuses to accept what your hands are telling it. I walked to the farmhouse. New lock there, too. I stood on the porch of the house I'd built with my own hands in 1989. The house where I'd brought my wife Irene after our wedding. The house where my daughter had been born during a February snowstorm because the roads were closed and we couldn't make it to the hospital in time, and I could not get inside. My son-in-law's truck was gone. My daughter's car was gone. The property was silent except for the wind coming down off the mountain. My neighbor Hank's place was a kilometer up the road. We'd shared fence lines and equipment and the occasional bottle of rye for 30 years. I drove up and knocked on his door. He answered quickly, the way people do when they've been watching for you. "Dennis," he said my name like it was a sentence on its own. "You know what happened." He looked at the ground. "Come inside." "I didn't go inside. I didn't go inside. Just tell me." He was quiet for a moment. "They came with a truck on Wednesday. Big rental, flat deck. Spent most of the day moving things around. Your son-in-law was directing it." He paused. I asked him what was going on. He said you'd decided to downsize. I was in Tofino. I know you were. He met my eyes. "I'm sorry, Dennis. I didn't know what to do. It didn't feel right, but it wasn't my place." I thanked him and got back in my truck. I called my daughter first. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Her voice, cheerful and recorded, "You've reached Nora. Leave me something good." I left her something. I kept it calm. I said I was back from Tofino. I'd found my tools on the fence line. I couldn't get into the house or the workshop, and I needed her to call me back immediately. I called my son-in-law next, Marcus, straight to voicemail without ringing, which meant he'd declined the call. I sat in my truck in Hank's driveway and thought about the last 3 years. Nora had called me in the fall of 2021, 2 years after her mother died, and asked if Marcus could help me run the property. The farm wasn't producing the way it used to. My knees weren't what they were, and some of the equipment needed attention I couldn't keep up with. Marcus had done some agricultural work out in the Okanagan and said he knew machinery. Nora said they wanted to move onto the land, help me out, be close to me. She said it in the way that made me feel like it was a gift she was offering. I said yes. Of course I said yes. Irene had been gone 2 years and the house was too quiet, and my daughter wanted to come home. We'd had a good first year. Marcus did know machinery, I'll give him that. He got the old tractor running properly for the first time in a decade. Nora planted a kitchen garden and started canning again the way her mother used to. We ate dinner together most nights. It felt like something I hadn't expected to have again. Then slowly, the way cold moves into a house through the gaps you don't notice until it's too late, things changed. Marcus started making decisions without asking me, small ones, at first. Moving equipment, changing suppliers, adjusting the field rotation. I raised it once and he said he was just trying to help, that I should focus on resting, that I'd earned it. The word earned bothered me, but I told myself I was being sensitive. By the second year, my daughter had stopped coming to the workshop. When I tried to talk to her about the farm, she'd redirect to something else, change the subject, suddenly need to make a phone call. At dinner, she and Marcus would have entire conversations I wasn't included in, not quietly, openly, like I was a piece of furniture that happened to be present. By last spring, Marcus had started referring to the property as our farm in front of other people. I heard him do it at the feed store in town, and my stomach turned cold. But I let it go. I told myself he meant it loosely, that it was just a way of speaking. The pile by the fence told me it wasn't. They came home at 6:30. I was still in my truck, parked in front of the workshop. My daughter got out of the car first, and when she saw me, something crossed her face, not surprise, not guilt exactly, more like the expression of someone who'd been waiting for a difficult conversation and was getting it over with. Marcus came around the front of the car and stood slightly behind her. He'd done that more and more in the last year, I'd noticed, always slightly behind. Dad. Nora's voice was careful. You're back early. I'm back when I said I'd be back. 5 days. I got out of the truck. Tell me what happened to my tools. She took a breath. We've been thinking about this for a while. Marcus and I. The workshop space. We need it. We're expanding the operation and we need that square footage, and honestly, Dad, you haven't been using it properly. Properly. You tinker. It's not productive use of. Those are my grandfather's planes, Nora. They're rusting on the ground. Marcus spoke up. We moved everything carefully. There's nothing damaged. I looked at him. The blades have started to rust. The tote on the number 4 plane has cracked from moisture. I'll need to reflatten the sole. I paused. But you wouldn't know what any of that means. His jaw tightened. This is my property, I said. My house, my workshop, my tools. Explain to me why there are locks on my doors that I don't have keys to. Nora looked at her hands. We just thought it would be cleaner. A clearer division. You have the suite. The suite. There was a small addition on the back of the house. 1 room, a bathroom, a closet. Something I'd built as a guest room. You'd have your own space, and we'd have ours. I don't want a suite. I want my house. Dad! Her voice went hard in a way I hadn't heard from her before. You're 67. You can't keep managing 40 acres and a workshop on your own. You needed help, and we came here to help you. We've put 3 years into this property. We've made it into something again. You put 3 years into my property. That I invited you onto. That you are living on rent-free. Marcus stepped forward. We've contributed significantly. You've contributed your labor. In exchange for housing, utilities, food, and use of all my equipment. That was the arrangement. I looked at my daughter. Was it not? She was quiet. The locks come off tonight, I said, and my tools come back inside. Marcus shook his head. That's not how this is going to work. You need to accept that things have changed. We're running this farm now. You can stay in the suite, and we'll take care of you. Take care of me. I said it flat, without inflection. Or you can find other arrangements. But the workshop is ours now, and the house is ours, and that's not going to change. My daughter said nothing. She looked somewhere past my shoulder. The same way Floyd had looked somewhere past his father's shoulder in 100 stories I'd heard and never thought would apply to me. I reached into my truck and got my overnight bag. I'd figure out where to put it later. I walked past them without saying anything else, got back in the truck and drove down the road. That's the moment, I found out later, when they stopped worrying. When they thought it was done, the Riverside Inn in town was $40 a night for a clean room with a view of the Thompson River. The woman at the desk, mid-50s, no nonsense, didn't ask questions. I signed in, carried my bag up the stairs, and sat on the edge of the bed. Outside the window, the river was moving fast with the fall runoff. Still and purposeful at the same time. I thought about Irene. She'd grown up on that land. Her parents had farmed the parcel to the east before they sold it in the 80s. When I bought my property in 1986, she'd cried. Happy tears, the kind she tried to hide, because she said it felt like coming home. We'd spent 31 years building something there. The workshop, the barn, the house, the garden, the relationship between the land and our hands. My daughter had grown up in that house. I had given her everything I could give. And tonight, she had stood in the driveway and said nothing while her husband told me to go live in a suite in the back of my own home. I picked up the phone and called my lawyer. James O'Coffer has handled my affairs since 2003. He's not the kind of man who expresses alarm, but when I finished explaining the situation, there was a pause that meant something. Come in tomorrow morning, he said. Bring whatever documentation you have with you. Deed, tax assessments, anything. I'd rescued a file box from my truck before I left, force of habit from 40 years of keeping records. I have every piece of paper related to that property going back to the original purchase. James's office was in a converted Victorian on the main street. I'd been there enough times to know which step creaked. His assistant brought coffee without being asked. I laid the documents out on his desk. Title deed in my name. Property tax notices in my name. The original mortgage, discharged in 2017. The agreement I'd signed with BCAA for the farm insurance, listing me as sole owner and primary operator. The agreement, informal, handwritten, but signed, that Marcus and Nora had put their names to when they moved in, acknowledging they were guests on the property and had no ownership interest. James looked at the last document for a long time. They signed this. Nora pushed back on it at the time. Marcus was fine with it. I told them it was just for insurance purposes, but I kept a copy. Smart man. He set it down and folded his hands. Dennis, you own this property outright. Your daughter and son-in-law have no legal claim to it whatsoever. The locks they've installed are, strictly speaking, an interference with your right to access your own property. You could have the RCMP attend with you right now if you wanted. I don't want that. Not yet. What do you want? I thought about it. I want them to understand what they've actually done, not just be told to leave. I want them to feel the ground shift under them, the way I felt it shift under me last night. James nodded slowly, the kind of nod that means a lawyer is already thinking 3 steps ahead. There are several ways we can proceed, but the most effective, given what you've described, is to list the property for sale. I was quiet for a moment. The whole thing. You own it. Every acre. You can do whatever you like with it, and once it's listed, once there are buyers walking through, they'll understand that their assumption about their future there is not a legal reality. It's not a threat. It's simply you exercising your rights as owner. I picked up my coffee. Let's talk about how to do this properly. 2 hours later, I'd spoken to a realtor named Patricia, not from the file, a common name I'm using for this account, and arranged to have the property listed by Tuesday. I'd also authorized James to send a formal notice to Nora and Marcus, informing them of the listing and their obligation as occupants to allow showings. Then I turned my phone off. I drove west. I hadn't decided where I was going until I was already an hour outside of town, and then it became obvious: the cabin near Clearwater, where Irene and I had honeymooned, the one run by the same family for 50 years, the one I'd called once a year for the past 3 decades, just to make sure it was still there. The owners, a couple in their 70s now, had a room available. "Thought you'd retired," the husband said when I checked in. "Taking some time," I said. "Good time of year for it." The cabin sat above a creek that ran fast and cold, even in October. Loons were still on the water. I hadn't heard a loon since Irene died, or maybe I had and just hadn't been paying attention. I turned my phone on once a day to check messages from James and the realtor. The rest of the time it stayed dark in my jacket pocket, quiet as a stone. The first message from Nora came Tuesday evening. Her voice was confused, not yet afraid. "Dad, there's a realtor here saying she needs to photograph the property. I don't understand what's happening. Call me." By Wednesday, the confusion had become something else. Dad, there's a lockbox on the front gate. People have been driving by slowly. Someone knocked on our door yesterday and said they were interested in buying. Please call me back. Marcus left one message, just one. His voice was controlled in a way that told me it was costing him something. Dennis. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. Whatever you think happened, we can discuss it like adults. Please return this call. I listened to it twice, then I deleted it." By Thursday, Nora had called 11 times. By Saturday, I'd stopped counting. I spent my mornings walking the creek trail, afternoons reading in the cabin. The owners brought dinner most evenings. Soup, bread, whatever they were making for themselves. They didn't ask questions. I think they understood, the way people who've lived long enough sometimes do, that a man sitting quietly above a creek in October might just need to be left alone to work something out. I thought about my daughter, not with anger, surprisingly, or not only with anger. I thought about when she was 7 and had fallen off the fence and broken her wrist, and the way she'd looked at me in the emergency room, frightened but completely certain that her father was going to make it all right. I thought about the night her mother died, how Nora had called me from the hospital parking lot and couldn't finish a sentence, and I'd driven 90 minutes in the dark to be there. I had given her everything, not as a transaction, just because that's what you do, and she had stood in the driveway and looked somewhere past my shoulder. That was the part I couldn't get past, not Marcus. Marcus was who he'd always been, someone looking for the easiest path to something that wasn't his. But Nora, my daughter, she'd stood there. I stayed at the cabin for 10 days. When I drove back into town, James had left a message saying he had paperwork for me to review. The realtor had 2 strong offers, both above asking, one from a couple from the lower mainland who wanted to start a market garden operation. She said they'd fallen in love with the workshop. I sat in the parking lot outside James's office for a while before going in. My daughter's car was parked across the street. She was sitting in it, watching the entrance to the building. She'd figured out where I was going before I got there. I got out of my truck and walked to her car. She got out when she saw me coming. She looked like she hadn't slept in a week, which I suspected she hadn't. "Dad." Her voice came out rough. "Please." I stopped a few feet away. "I know I need to explain," she said. "I know there's nothing I can say that." She stopped. "Tried again. Marcus pushed for this. The whole plan, the locks, moving your things. He'd been talking about it for months, and I kept telling him no, and then I stopped telling him no, and then I stopped telling him no, and I—" She put her hands over her face. "I stood there and said nothing. I know I did." I waited. "Where are we supposed to go?" The question came out small, the way her voice had been small when she was 7 and frightened. "Dad, where are we supposed to go?" "That's a real question," I said. "And you should be asking it. You should have been asking it before you changed my locks." She lowered her hands. Her eyes were red. "We can find somewhere. I know we can. Please don't sell to strangers. Please, Mom loved that land. That landed where she knew it would." "I'm not made of stone. Your mother," I said carefully, "would be heartbroken right now. Not because of what I'm doing, because of what you did." She didn't say anything. "You have 1 week." Not because I'm softening, because it's a reasonable amount of time to make arrangements. I looked at her. James will have the keys ready for me this afternoon. I'll be back at the property tonight. Marcus can stay if he needs a few extra days for logistics, but I want him clearly understanding that it's my property, my timeline, my decisions. He knows, she said quietly. He figured it out. She paused. He's not doing well. That's not my concern right now. I left her standing by her car and went inside to sign papers. James had coffee ready. He reviewed the offers with me, went through the details, asked if I wanted more time to decide. I told him I wanted to think about it for 48 hours. Walking out of his office, I sat in my truck and held my phone. I didn't call Nora back. Not yet. But I thought about that kitchen garden she'd planted. Irene's canning jars on the shelf. The way the light comes through the workshop windows at noon in January, long and low, hitting the tools in a way that's always made me think the work matters. I thought about the young couple from the lower mainland, eager and grateful, ready to make something of the land. I thought about what Irene would say, whether she'd want strangers there or her daughter, and I didn't know the answer. I really didn't know. What I did know was that the ground had shifted, and that Nora had felt it, and that some things, once you've understood them, can't be unknown. I accepted the offer from the couple in the lower mainland 10 days later. Marcus had moved out before the end of the first week. I'll say that for him. He didn't fight it. He took his truck and his tools and his plans for someone else's future, and he left without a scene. Nora stayed to pack properly. She worked quietly, methodically, the way her mother used to work when something hard needed doing. The night before she left, she knocked on the workshop door. I was at the bench, flattening the sole of my grandfather's handplane, the one that had cracked in the rain. She stood in the doorway and looked at the tools on the wall, the ones I'd rehung in their proper places. "I used to watch you in here," she said, "when I was little. I remember. You'd let me hand you things, make me feel like I was helping even when I wasn't." She was quiet for a moment. I don't know when I stopped being that person. I kept working the plane across the reference surface, feeling for flat, the way my grandfather had shown me. "I love you," she said. "I know that's not enough right now. But I do. I know you do." I set the plane down. That's the part that makes it complicated. She left in the morning. I watched her drive down the gravel road, and I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt tired, the way you feel after a storm, when everything is still and the damage is visible and there's nothing to do but start putting things back in order. The new owners arrived on a Friday, the husband and wife, younger than I expected. They walked through the workshop with a kind of careful attention that told me they actually knew what they were looking at. She pointed to the handplanes on the wall and asked about them, and I told her the story about my grandfather bringing them from Scotland. "They're not part of the sale," I told her. "I just wanted you to know the history of the space." "Of course," she said. "This place has good bones." I was renting a 2-bedroom apartment in town by then, on the 3rd floor with a view of the river. Temporary, probably. I wasn't sure yet where I was going to land. Nora called me from wherever she and Marcus had gone, 3 weeks after the sale closed. She didn't ask about the money or the property. She asked how I was doing. I told her I was figuring it out. She said she was too. It wasn't a repair. It was a beginning, maybe, of the long, slow work of figuring out whether something broken can become something different. Not the same, but real. I think about my grandfather's plane sometimes. The way a good tool, damaged by carelessness, can be brought back to true with enough patience and skill. The work is slow and quiet, and you have to know what you're doing. But it's possible. It's almost always possible if the material is sound. I had to find out the hard way whether we were. There's a thing that happens when you flatten the handplane sole that's been warped. You can't force it. You can't rush it. You work slowly across a reference surface, feeling for the high spots, taking off just enough material, checking again. If you get impatient and push too hard, you overshoot and create a new problem. The work teaches you that some things only come right through steadiness and honest attention. I think about that a lot when I think about what happened with Nora and Marcus. What Marcus did was calculated. He saw a piece of land that wasn't his, decided it should be, and moved methodically toward taking it. That kind of thinking always runs into a wall eventually, not because the universe is keeping score in any mystical sense, but because real ownership has real paperwork, and real paperwork doesn't care about someone's assumptions. He built his plans on a foundation he'd never actually verified. That's not bad luck. That's the natural consequence of skipping the honest work of understanding what you're actually dealing with. But I've spent more time thinking about Nora than about Marcus. She knew what was right. I'm certain of that. There were years of knowing her, of watching her grow up in that house, and the person who stood in the driveway looking past my shoulder was not someone who had lost her sense of right and wrong. She was someone who had temporarily suspended it because it was easier than the confrontation. That's a different thing, and in some ways a harder one to reckon with. Marcus acted without conscience. Nora acted against hers. She had the understanding and chose to set it aside. What I had to ask myself, driving back from Clearwater, was whether I had been paying close enough attention over those 3 years. The signs were there. The way Marcus had started saying, "our farm," the way Nora had stopped coming to the workshop. I'd seen it and made excuses, because making excuses was more comfortable than dealing with what I was actually seeing. I'd need some honesty about my own part in that. The hardest thing about getting older isn't the physical part, though that's plenty hard enough. It's learning to see clearly when you drop a knot, to look at what's actually in front of you instead of what you'd like to be there. I'd spent 3 years not quite looking, and it cost me 10 days in a motel and a cabin before I had the distance to think straight. What I know now is that the ability to act, to pick up the phone and call James, to drive to the realtor, to turn my phone off and let the consequences land, that came from having kept my own records, maintained my own affairs, stayed informed about my own life even when I wasn't sure any of it mattered anymore. Irene used to say I was too careful with paperwork. That file box I pulled from the truck before I left the property is the reason I had any ground to stand on. The tools in my workshop are back on their proper hooks. My grandfather's number 4 plane cuts true again. Nora and I are somewhere in the long, slow work of figuring out what comes next between us. It won't be quick, and it won't be easy, and I'm not interested in pretending otherwise. But the work is possible. That much I know.